particular subtopic is only the election of John F. Kennedy as President of the United States and his inauguration. So our first subtopic is the presidential election of 1960. Question?
No.
Okay. The presidential election of 1860 is going to be wide open, kind of like this last presidential election we had in our country, because when a two-term president is limited by the 22nd Amendment, it really opens up an election to new people. And that's kind of what happened in our last election we had presently, and that happened in this election as well. Now, you've got to remember that the Republican Party had controlled the White House for the past 8 years. Usually when you have a two-term president, the other party has a lot of what they call hopefuls for the presidency, people that want to run. That necessarily wasn't so much the case here in modern history. In the last election, we had, I think, trouble getting good candidates. But in this particular election, because the Republican Party had controlled the White House for 8 years, several Democratic hopefuls will be interested in running for the presidency. Now, on the Republican Party, it really wasn't that way. It was pretty much accepted that Vice President Richard Nixon, who had served 2 terms under Eisenhower, would probably be the shoo-in for the Republican Party nomination for president, although he's going to face a little unexpected challenge. However, in the Democratic National Convention, you're going to see a lot and hear about a lot of names, okay? We'll kind of go from there. So, we'll start with the Democratic Party. There were actually 5 pretty important men that were interested in the Democratic nomination for president in 1960. That's kind of an unusually large number, especially when you look at the moxie that these 5 men have. They are not slouches by any stretch. Matter of fact, 4 of the 5 are serving as United States senators at the time. Okay? So there's going to be 5 men interested in the Democratic nomination for president in 1960, and 4 of the 5 were senators. Okay? The first one we are familiar with, Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts. He's one that's interested in the Democratic nomination for president. Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts. Another one we've heard of because he gave a pro-civil rights speech was Senator Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota. We've talked about him before. Senator Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota. Remember, he gave the pro-civil rights speech during the campaign election, the Democratic National Convention in 1948. It split up the South. South walked out of the convention. But he was interested in the presidency. The third one might have been the most powerful senator of the 4, and that was Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas, because he was the Senate Majority Leader at the time. So Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas was interested in the presidency. And the final senator was a little lesser known, but a very powerful man, Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri. Here is a picture of Stuart Symington, his campaign button, and the signature right there. So we'll be starting to get on the wall here on signatures. So Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri. So you have Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, Senator Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas, and Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri. Anybody want to guess who the 5th hopeful was that wasn't a senator that you've heard of? No, he's going to be on the Republican side. Somebody we've talked about. Didn't do very well in the last 2 elections. Adlai Stevenson. Even though he was a 2-time loser in 52 and 56, he had a lot of moxie within the Democratic Party, and he had some thoughts of running again. Now, he's going to sit in the background and wait and see what happens with these 4 senators. And if these 4 senators falter, nobody raises very much enthusiasm among the 4, then he's going to kind of sneak in. And every time they ask him if he's a candidate for president, he always says, "Oh no, I'm not a candidate for president." But he's sitting in the back just waiting to see how things go. Okay? Now, obviously, you have a couple of front runners, people that step to the front and look like they're the ones going to get the nomination. It just so happened that the 2 front runners of these 5 hopefuls were Senator Kennedy of Massachusetts and Senator Humphrey of Minnesota. They stood out as the front runners, the ones that look like they may get the nomination. And both had issues they had to overcome if they were going to win support of the Democratic voters at convention. Both had things to overcome. Both Kennedy and Humphrey had issues. Humphrey really had one issue and Kennedy had two. Now at the time, a majority of the Democratic Party were considered conservative. And the problem that Hubert Humphrey had is he was viewed as too liberal. Okay? So that's the thing he had to overcome. Since most of the Democratic Party considered them conservatives, the problem that Hubert Humphrey had to overcome was he was viewed by the party as too liberal. Now John Kennedy had two things to overcome. Anybody want, Dane, you want to take a guess on what one of them was?
I don't know if he was Catholic.
He was Roman Catholic. No one of that religion had ever been elected to the highest political office in the land in the history of our country. Only one, and we'll talk about him later, ever gained the nomination for his party. So that was a definite issue he had to overcome. How about another one? Anybody have another one? Think about it. People would be critical of his age. He was just 43, and many people saw him as inexperienced and unproven. So Humphrey had to overcome the fact that he was too liberal for Democratic voters. John Kennedy had to overcome the fact that he was Roman Catholic and no candidate of that religion had ever been elected to the highest political office in the land. And he was also young and considered inexperienced and unproven. Now getting into present days a little bit, we had that issue, my opinion, with Mitt Romney. What was Mitt Romney? LDS. You know, people said the same thing, but you could believe it that many years later. My God, if John Kennedy gets elected, the Pope's going to run the country. My God, if Mitt Romney gets elected, the Mormon Church is going to run the country. That was stated on many occasions. I'm not so sure. Well, to be honest with you, I voted Democrat my entire life until I did vote for Mitt Romney. I wasn't afraid of that. But that was an issue. If you paid attention at that time, people said that. Unfortunately, we hadn't come very far since 1960, but that was the case. Sometimes that matters. Now, if you know anything about the precursor to a Democratic National Convention, what type of elections do they have to kind of let the delegates that go to convention figure out who's the best? What do they have? Primary elections. And that's where you go to elect people only within your own party. When you have a primary election before a general election, you have to say in Washoe County if you're Republican or Democrat. And then when you go to the polls, they give you a Republican or Democrat ballot because it's a primary election. So if Macklin and Dalton are running for president, the Democrats want to kind of get an idea of who people want. So they have a primary election and only Democrats vote on that. And whoever seems like they're ahead or wins these primary elections usually goes to convention and gets the nomination. Okay? Now in Washoe County, it's a little scary if you go to the courthouse and register as a Democrat, because there's only about 3 in town. But anyway, that's kind of funny when you go to the polls and you see the Democratic line and the Republican line, there's kind of a difference in this county. But anyway, but that's what you do. Well, there were two very important primary elections that were coming up in 1960 that might make the difference in who gets the nomination. The first one was in Wisconsin, and the second one was in West Virginia. So during this campaign for the nomination in 1960 concerning the Democratic Party, there were two really important primary campaigns coming up, one in Wisconsin and one in Virginia. Now, Kennedy's goal, like maybe our football team's goal this weekend, Torrington's goal is to crush the Warriors 65-0 to leave no doubt that they're the best team in the league going forward. Where Warland's goal might be to lull them to sleep. We're going to be the underdog, and if we can just hang in there with them and maybe force them into overtime, even though you want to win, you might see that as, God, we went down to Torrington and took them to 6 overtimes. Doggone, they beat us on that extra point. Would you maybe, even though you didn't win, say, hey, we played pretty, you'd feel better about yourself? Okay? Well, that was the situation in Wisconsin. Kennedy wanted a knockout punch in Wisconsin. He felt if he crushed Humphrey in the Wisconsin primary, that Humphrey would quit and be done. Just like if our football team, for example, goes out trying to get beat 60-0, we're going to walk away thinking we're not very good, and we're going to probably feel bad about football and quit. Okay? Well, what was Humphrey's goal, Morgan, in the Wisconsin primary?
Is he going to try to?
Well, maybe not even win, just lose close. Because if he loses close, it shows the Democratic Party that he's competing with John Kennedy. So when the results come in, Senator Kennedy does defeat Humphrey in the Wisconsin primary, but it is no knockout. It actually is pretty close. And so Humphrey is thinking, hey, I still may have a chance at convention because I'm hanging in there with him. So Humphrey's got to hang in with him again where now? West Virginia. The issue in West Virginia is going to be that 95% of the people there are what? Not Catholic. They're Protestants. Okay? So if Kennedy goes into West Virginia and beats Humphrey, not even a knockout, but beats Humphrey, that's going to kind of quiet the religious issue, right? And it's going to tell him that he's going to pave his way to nomination at the convention. So the primary election in West Virginia becomes a do-or-die situation for the Kennedy campaign. A close win or even a loss in this primary is going to prove disastrous for Kennedy. He would surely be unable to secure the nomination if that's the case. And he sees it as kind of difficult because 95% of the voters in West Virginia are going to be Protestant. Well, Kennedy campaigns tirelessly. He really gets after it. He's got a big network behind him. On the other hand, Humphrey's running out of money, can't even purchase campaign buttons, and he's kind of on the end of the roll. But he feels like if he can win, lose by a close margin or beat Kennedy in West Virginia, he's still in the race and he can get more people to donate to his campaign. Well, on May 10th of 1960, Kennedy wins a smashing victory over Humphrey in West Virginia, receiving 60% of the vote, which is pretty big when 95% of the people there are Protestant. Okay? So Kennedy defeats Humphrey by 60% of the vote, and it knocks Humphrey out of the race. He's out of campaign money, he withdraws, and it kind of paves the way for Senator Kennedy at the national convention. And the other thing was it quieted the religious issue to a point. When 60% of Protestants basically vote for you, that quieted those things up. So, we take ourselves now, the primaries have ended, and we take you to the 1960 Democratic National Convention that's held in Los Angeles, California. Okay? We take you to the 1960 National Convention that's held in Los Angeles, California. Now, I got to explain how the convention works. Kind of like the election, you need a certain number of delegate votes to get the nomination. And what happens is states send delegates, Democratic delegates, to cast their votes for their state in this election. And how many delegates gets depended by population. So actually, in one election, when I was back in Montana and a younger teacher, I was an alternate to be a delegate to go to the National Democratic Convention, which would have been pretty cool. If somebody would not have been able to go, I could have gone and I would have got a vote. And I could have cast my vote for whichever candidate I wanted. Well, in this particular election, there were 761 votes that were needed. If you were going to gain the nomination, you had to pick up 761 delegates from all over the country to vote for you. Okay? Now, how this works is it's a roll call by alphabetical order. So they take the first state in the union alphabetically, and they'll say, the people stand up and say, the great state of Alabama, home of the 2015 National Championship Crimson Tide football team, cast their 31 votes to the next President of the United States, Casey Wassam. And then they tally that to Casey. Now, could the delegates split? Could they give 15 one way and 16 another? They could. But generally that doesn't happen. They get together and make a choice. And they go down the line. And so if you go all the way down the line A through Z, and a candidate does not have 761 delegate votes, what do you think happens? They go to what they call a second ballot. Now when they go to a second ballot and start up here again, what about all those ballots that were cast the first time? Start over. So more politicking's done, more elbow rubbing, and you don't really want to go to a second ballot if you're leading on a first ballot because the chances are that could change. So, they go down the ballot, this is what I think is great. They go down the ballot, and Kennedy thinks if we go to a second ballot, guess who's going to maybe get this nomination? Not Humphrey, but Lyndon Johnson was starting to get some support at the convention, because it's a big butt-kissing process. That's what you do at the convention is, you know, Lise, I know you're kind of into John Kennedy, but I think Lyndon Johnson, how about if you give us their delegate votes? You know, they actually even go to individual delegates and try to get them to do that. Well, Kennedy's thinking, oh my God, if this goes to a second ballot, I may lose momentum, because he's winning down the roll call, but it's very, very close if he's going to get to 761. So, it goes all the way to down, and one state gives their 23 delegate votes to Kennedy, which puts him over the top and gives him the 761 he needs. Okay, so finally a state gives him their 23 votes that they need to secure his nomination. Anybody want to guess what state that was? Come on. We're in alphabetic. Wyoming. When Wyoming gave their 23 delegate votes to Kennedy, he gets the 761 he needs. So Wyoming, in essence, gives Kennedy the nomination, which elects him president, which is the reason we're sitting in this class today, if you think about that. Because historians will tell you if that would have gone to a second vote, that Lyndon Johnson more than likely would have gained nomination for the presidency. So that's a little bit of Wyoming history for you. So when Wyoming, the last state to vote, gave their 23 delegate votes to Senator Kennedy, he reached the 761 he needed, and his nomination was secured. Now, because he was smart and he knew he'd need to carry the South if he was going to win the election of 1960, Kennedy then chose Lyndon Johnson to be his running mate. Okay? Even though they didn't have a lot of the same philosophies, or frankly later didn't even like each other that much, Kennedy chose Lyndon Johnson of Texas to be his vice presidential running mate. Now, I'm going to give you a little note here, write it down if you want. Historians later stated, which I already mentioned, if it had gone to a second ballot, chances are Johnson would have won. But they said if Adlai Stevenson would have from the start committed to running for president again in 1960, more than likely he would have gained the nomination. That's what historians say. So it was very, in a way, unusual or a bit of an upset that John Kennedy gained the nomination in the first place, just so you know. Okay, well let's move on to the Republican National Convention, which is going to be held in Chicago. Well, prior to the convention, all of a sudden Vice President Richard Nixon got a little competition for the nomination, and that competition was New York Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller. Got a poster up there, maybe if you're interested, above the flag that's signed. Nelson Rockefeller. Turns out to be a challenge to Vice President Nixon, and Nixon's not liking it much because he thinks, hey, I served 8 years under a popular president in Dwight Eisenhower and I should just walk to the nomination. He finds out that's not true. Now, with ego getting ahead, to try to solve the problem, what's the first thing Nixon did when he had a conversation with Rockefeller? Don't run against me, run with me. And he tries to talk him into being his vice presidential candidate. And he says no. Rockefeller says no. So Nixon tries to unite the party by asking Governor Rockefeller to be his running mate, but Rockefeller refuses. And the problem at this time was the Republicans, Rockefeller's supporters, and Nixon's supporters had serious disagreements on the party platform. And when you go into an election with a split platform, who does the advantage go to? The other party. So Nixon's not a fool. He thinks the only way this thing's going to work, the only way I'm going to get Rockefeller to back off and not run against me, is to meet with him. So because of the controversy, Nixon asked Rockefeller to meet with him. And Nixon was even smarter because he asked Rockefeller to meet in New York, which was whose turf? Rockefeller. So to get away with the intimidation factor, or maybe the good neighbor policy, he says, hey, I need to meet with you. We got to talk about this. I'll even come to New York and meet you there. And he chooses to do that. Now, when Nixon goes to New York, he has two goals he wishes to accomplish from his meeting with Rockefeller. So Nixon shows this compromise. He agrees to meet with Governor Rockefeller on his turf in New York. And when Vice President Nixon goes to New York, he has two important goals he wishes to accomplish from his meeting. What do you think his goals are? He wants to come out of there accomplishing these two goals to get things back in order. Anybody want to guess what one of them was? To again talk Rockefeller into being his running mate. That's one thing. And the second thing he wants to get accomplished is we got to have a compromise on what? Compromise on what that we're disagreeing on?
Platform.
The platform, the Republican Party platform. So when Vice President Nixon goes to New York to meet with Rockefeller, he's going to first of all try to convince him again to be his running mate, and he wants to try to work out a compromise on the Republican platform with Rockefeller so they don't have division. Nixon was only able to complete one of those two goals. Which one was it? That'd be the platform, because if he talked him into running with him, the platform would have taken care of itself. So they did come up with a compromise on the Republican Party platform, but Rockefeller did not want to run with Nixon for vice president. Well, this compromise on the part of Nixon and Rockefeller paved the way for Nixon to receive the nomination in Chicago on the first ballot, and then Nixon chose this fellow right here, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., to become his running mate in 1960. And he was a very popular politician. Now, a lot of people don't know this if they know anything about the election of 1960. But there were some Democrats that weren't really very thrilled with Senator Kennedy's nomination. Where do you think they were located geographically? In the South.